Andy, thank you for such generous words. I too would like to acknowledge the lands on which we are gathered. These are the lands of the Wurundjeri people who have lived, loved and died in these lands for thousands of generations. I'd like to acknowledge the millions that were murdered in genocide of colonialism. They are buried in these lands. They're unnamed, but never forgotten. I have to acknowledge the disruption of colonialism and what it has cost us over the past 200 plus years, and to acknowledge all of us as part of this shared journey in this country. But in particular, I'd like to acknowledge my little Barai. I'm her Lenya. She's 5, she starts school next year. And as much as we brag about, isn't it wonderful to see Aboriginal people taking up writing and arithmetic and all those wonderful Western skills? It's not the only way to learn things, you know. It's not the only way to be in this world. I trust that somewhere in her little life, her long life, her life without me, that she will learn something of our people who could tell stories, who could paint pictures, who could sing songs, who didn't need Western extractive education and Western extractive systems to somehow justify their existence in this world. I trust that somewhere in her life she can touch a tree, cuddle a koala, put her feet in the river, swim in the oceans, and that they are all healthy with her. Waminjaka ganokandana marakoki. Thank you. Tim, thank you. I have to acknowledge, when I read your paper that Andy sent me through, touched by my own theological education way back there in the 90s, when there was barely an Aboriginal reference on the bookshelves. In fact, I don't think there was any. And if there was something, it was written by another fella. So I'm going to tell you a little Baptist story. Please do not take offence. This is real. And I don't know how many of you have ever experienced an Aboriginal community, but you know, way back then somewhere, a Baptist, and he was a Baptist minister, was talking to a group of elder men, you know, sitting on the ground, and he was telling them about repentance. 45 minutes. Repent, repent. I hope you can imagine what that sermon was like, can you? When he finished, exhausted, I don't know whether any of you have ever had this experience of sitting with a group of elders and you finish talking and there's just dead silence. Nothing happens. Nothing is said. And for a long time, nothing was said. And one old fella at the back said, "Sonny, you're all wrong. That's not what John the Baptist did. What John the Baptist did was take the Jewish people back to the river where they became the Jewish people. He took them back to their dreaming. He took them back to remember who they were and where they had come from. He took them back to remember." That's an Aboriginal interpretation of a Christian text. And I think it's interesting. I've got another personal story I'd like to tell you. It's about a cupboard. I've just had a whole series of cupboards built along a wall in my house. I'm severely allergic to dust. And you know what books are? Love dust. So every time I, take out a book, I'd spend the day wheezing and sneezing. So I've had this cupboard built with doors, and there's a wonderful section in the colonial section with a whole line of books with titles around white and black. There's another section around sort of the philosophical, the mainstream, what I would call non-Indigenous books on philosophy and ethics, because technically, if you want to look at my research, it would be philosophical and ethical. The centre bit is the artistic and the books that I love reading. The next bit goes into what I consider the voice of country. the voice of the trees, the voice of the animals, the voice of the real world. Because one of the things that colonialism did was it came to this Garden of Eden, and Tim, it created Gethsemane. As I look across my country, 1 million of our species have disappeared, millions more without that we've never even been able to name them. That's 1 million species of animals, insects, birds, fish that have disappeared in less than 200 years. When I look across this country, I see the denuded landscape of our forests, of some of the most remarkable trees in the world. We have the tallest flowering tree in the world, the amazing mountain ash. When I look across this country, I see it scarred by an economic system that demands we dig the land up and kill it off. A Western, extractive, linear economic system that is built on the value of land. Now, I'm very curious about this, so I went back to discover when did country, now country is the way I describe land, it's all those relationships between air and water and sun and stars and animals and birds and insects and bacteria, all of those complex, messy relationships that the colonists loathed, every single one of them. So when I look out across this country and I see what colonialism has done, not just to us the people, but to the very nature of this country, and I look into the eyes of the colonists and I wonder, why? Why do you tell me that what you've done is civilizing? Why do you tell me that what you've done is civilization? Why did you murder my people? Why did you destroy my identity? Because, Tim, it's interesting, me standing here, pink. Well, I'm not really brown, am I? But inside me somewhere is a Negro. I have an Ondu heritage somewhere, along with my Aboriginal heritage. And the problem with that is there could be a mixture of Aboriginal heritages there, along with English, well, I think Northern England and Scottish, some Eastern Europeans thrown in there and some Spanish. That's, I'm taking genetic analysis very sceptically, everybody. But that I would dare, and throughout my theological education I was challenged that how dare I, and are you a real Aboriginal or not? And I felt like saying, are you a real person or not? So when a people come to a country, call it Eden, and turn it into Gethsemane, not just for an individual, but for the very essence of its life, how do I respond? And I wonder in the debates around race that we forget that Jesus was a very dark brown man. The very race he came from, the very race that originated this religion that we're all adherents to. I wonder if we remember that. But the powers and I really enjoyed that Roman remembrance. I think all the problems, I always talk about the problem with Paul was he wanted to get to Rome, and he sure did. When the colonists turned this country into Gethsemane, what they did was take the power of country itself, the very essence that gives us life, and turned it into concrete and asphalt, turned it into an Egyptian, Roman, Hittite, Greekan empire. We have never got over that, have we? The fact that we can't live with ourselves, so we can't live with anything else either. The very fact that we had to destroy the very essence of this country to prove who we were astounds me to this day. Do you realise that here in Victoria, the Department of whatever it was, constant name changes, the Department of Environmental something, has just released a permission for 230,000 kangaroos to be shot this year. The cruelest shoot, not just here in Victoria but across the whole, but here in particular in Victoria, for commercial reasons. The Liberal politician Matt Canavan said, we will not, under any circumstances, stop the commercial shooting of kangaroos because it's worth 300 million to our bottom line. We don't think there are 230,000 kangaroos left in this state, because last year they couldn't get 100,000 kangaroos. When I go to buy dog food for my little Westie, yes, West Highland Terrier, I don't buy roo meat ever. I don't eat kangaroo, I will not eat emu, I will not eat anything that's native to this country for the very reason it's been commercialised for killing. Stories of some of our creatures. Do you know that the lyrebird, who knows the lyrebird? Do you know it's the oldest songbird in the world? The lyrebird gave the world song. The sweetest song in the world came from our forests. How many of you know white sulphur-crested cockatoos, black cockatoos, galahs? How many of you know our parrot races? They gave the world bird intelligence. Colonialism didn't destroy the people, it destroyed the very stories of this country. Western Christianity came and supplanted what I consider to be one of the richest spiritualities that I'm beginning to re-experience, took it away, forbade it to be told and shared, forbade the language, forbade the people, in fact, slaughtered the people. You cannot have your languages, you cannot have your colour. Here in Victoria, the missions were responsible for breeding programs. As you can see, how many of you have seen Rabbit Proof Fence? Do you see the chart of colours? 3 generations and you can breed the colour out. Now the only reason, I'm sure many of you know these stories, don't you? Many of you are hearing these stories over these since reconciliation in the 1990s, are starting to hear these stories over and over again. How many of us resent them? How many of us find them painful? I do. In fact, when I started my research way back in about just before Adam was born, I think. How many of you know about PhD research? It's really the crappiest journey on earth. I should be in an insane asylum. And my supervisor said, you know, how about going and studying the history of Melbourne? I said, oh, come on. There's no history of Melbourne. We don't talk about it, do we? How many of you know the history of Melbourne? How many of you have looked at it? There's a lovely little book by James Joyce called 1835. There's a lovely line in it for all us Christians. The invasion of Melbourne was totally illegal, and there's a whole history around that. But in they came. And it's quite funny because in it, James, the evangelicals back in Clapham House eternally have that question to answer. You allowed the invasion of Victoria. How come you allowed Melbourne to be established? An illegal process. Totally illegal. I'm just saying all of this because this is our origins. If we call ourselves Australians, and I don't know whether I do, I wrote to the Electoral Commission recently and said that I did not like the fact that you were forcing me to vote for a plutocratic government. I could not, in all conscience, support governments that are funded by lobbyists. How dare you allow democracy to be so corrupted? How dare you take away our rights with such, what I call an insidious nature of the political games. How dare you? I haven't got a response yet. I'm sure to be gracious, don't you? But it's also really interesting, Tim, when you look at me and I'm up here talking from the perspective of Victorian Aboriginal, and my heritage comes from South Australia to some degree. There's some here in Victoria, a little bit in Tasmania, this sort of, mixture of the purges that were done across this country. I was also reminded very recently, I was in the chemist shop and a woman behind me tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "You're from the aristocracy in Britain, aren't you?" Yeah, I said. Royalty, in fact. I'd love to tell you the story about why I talk the way I do. My mother was so terrified that I'd end up like a screeching barn owl, like some of my aunties, that she spent days teaching me to inflect properly, how to sit properly and how to speak proper. It's really interesting. But I just wanted us to reflect. And when we talk about, and I love this shelf in my new cupboard, that is all about titles with black or black and white in them. I think I was reminded several years ago that technically we're really all pink. Even dark-skinned people are pink underneath because of course, we all have red blood, I hope. Do we? Good. You realise trees, what's their green stuff called? Resembles the red corpuscles in they're green corpuscles. Don't get me onto the patterns of nature and the patterns of us, because that's where my art is. I think of nothing better than how we are shaped like the planet, how we are shaped like aspects of nature. But that's why I wanted to really get to, because, Tim, I don't believe in objectivity at all. And I was I passed my theological, but I was so raw and so new. And the whole episode was quite a challenge to me every step of the way. And there was the odd, amazing teacher that allowed me to be me, that allowed me to say, but if you say God, isn't that dog backwards? And that amazing old Hebrew scholar said, it's interesting you would say that, because do you realise one of the Jewish words for God is to love like a dog? I didn't know that, but I knew when you spelt God backwards, you got dog. What we don't know is, I think, just as important as what we do know. And the reason I'm getting to this is when, in my journey of research, and I take it more as a life journey rather than at some point having to hand some incredibly Western system. Somehow I'm expected to do some lit review. How about I do that on country? I said, and the guy just looked at me. What are you talking about? I said, well, how about I talk about the trees, what they say? No, you can't do that. Why not? Why can't I talk about the stories of birds? Why can't I talk about a country that talks to me? I was out recently we're cool burning out in the Marul, out in the Yarra Valley. You know what cool burning is? We're actually burning the landscape as our Aboriginal ancestors used to. And we were sitting in a place that had been burnt 3 years ago. And I have never felt so profound in all my life. You could actually hear the trees talking. The land was singing. It was so alive. There is a wonderful word, wii, from the Yolngu people, which says everything is shimmering alive. Everything shimmers with life. And there were a group of us sitting there and we all said the same thing. These trees are so alive. You can almost hear them. The grass is so green. It's almost like it's part of us. Because one of the things I'm interested in is relationality. How many of you are in relationships? I have a great relationship with my dog. His name's Ka'al, Gunjintamara for dog. K-A:'L. Ka'al. Say it all together. Ha. Oh, don't forget the breath. Remember that beautiful, those beautiful languages that use the breath. Now, the reason I've taken you on this rambling journey from Eden to Gethsemane is because I want you to take note that the more I worked on relationality, the more I kept asking, what is that? What is it? How do we know we're in relationship? Is it what I do to somebody else or what somebody does to me? When I watch my little Barai from a newborn to 5, how does she know? How do I know what her parents are doing is good for her? How do I know that? And the question I came to was, we create each other, don't we? Children are born soaking up life around them. Of course, we guide them and we hold them. But how many of us take responsibility for the fact that we're all in partnership with each other? That everything we do and say has an impact. And when I look at country, and I think this is where we can see the greatest example of this, you can see what a particular type of humanity has done to this country, what it has done globally, the same kind of humanity, that Western, extractive, linear, only thinking for the growth of the future, that is never satisfied with the here and now, never satisfied with the humility or the humbleness of now, and is incapable of receiving. Can give a lot, but I don't see it receiving. That ability to be sensitive to how we create each other. And I was really fascinated, Tim, to hear you talk about epigenetics and post-traumatic. I mean, I live in a community that is so destroyed by post-traumatic stress syndrome that is generational old. My wonderful daughter is a senior teacher in Swan Hill. Now, that's up along the Murray River, northwest. Am I right? Northwest. And she's an art teacher, but she works with traumatised children. She works with all the complex and difficult children that nobody else wants. She's out mixing with the drug addicts. She's out mixing with all the problem people because she sees the trauma in every child. She has 10 incredibly traumatised children. They're all ranging from years 7 till 9. She spends half an hour with them each morning. Do you know what she's doing with them? Because you know what trauma does? The first thing trauma does is rips you out of your body, sticks you up in your head, and you're locked up there by the adrenal glands. The adrenaline locks you up here in the stress areas of the brain. She is spending the next 2 years, this is how long it will take her, she said, at least to get them to recognise what their bodies are, to get them back in touch with their arms and legs and their hearts and lungs. It's recognised. Western science has taught her that. Because she sees the value in these children. Because she said one day they will understand more than those that haven't been affected by this kind of pain. They will be able to help others. She's actually got them doing the most amazing things. Cleaning toilets, painting classrooms. They've built their own classroom. They now refurbish stoves and microwaves and fridges. They're called hands-on learners. You see, there are all kinds of ways of learning. We don't need to read and write. Aboriginal people didn't read and write. They told stories and drew pictures. For me, it's become so important to receive the other. It's a wonderful term. How many of you have heard of Dadiri? Well, we were talking about it and we wrote a submission, part of the Yarra Ranges Council, about working with we use the term Dadiri. The governing body wrote back and said, what's your own language? Because Dadiri is a Northern Territory word. And specific locals is very important. Our local place is very, very important. So we found the term Miram Naganga, which means it's a sort of a term called deep listening, but it means to be as the country is. To listen is to receive. In the reception, we give. Not in that dominating, not in the colonial, invasive model. And that, of course, we're talking generational change, aren't we? We're talking a sense of changing a whole demeanour of a people. Whatever we think skin colour is, whatever we think that has created these different races, the superiority of some over others, the greed, the wealth. I mean, I think one of the most debilitating things that I see in the world is that absolutely obscene wealth. How many of you noticed here in Melbourne the rebellion against the arms? Isn't it wonderful? We can have an exhibition centre full of the biggest, most powerful armaments across the globe, but don't let people rebel outside. What a dilemma to find ourselves in, that somehow we can't have a voice that says, why do you have to make war? Why can't we say no to that? Can anybody answer me? It's okay to sell armaments? Is it? Because war seems to be our nature, doesn't it? We create each other through dominance and power. We turn the Garden of Eden into the Garden of Gethsemane. How many of you bushwalk? I'd like you to walk, and every time you walk in it, just allow it to talk to you. Allow it to tell it's what's left of it, to tell its story. Because the other thing I think Western Christianity is responsible for is, of course, the overpopulation of humanity. We're out of control. And it's well known that we're a species out of control. And that's because we have no self-respect as a species. We do not know our place in the Garden of Eden. And I find it interesting that the biblical text starts with the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. I'm going to finish with another little story. In 1843, this is 8 years after the invasion of Melbourne began, and the mass of humanity that came through the ports and up that river is phenomenal in those first 2 decades. 60,000 people landed in this along the banks of the Yarra. But that's not the story I want to tell. In fact, the research is heartbreaking, just that a mass of humanity right up until Federation. Bill Bellary, who was one of the Wurundjeri, who was at his in 1843, made the first official land claim here in Australia. He went to the military, the English government of New South Wales, and he said, please give us back some of our land. Please. If you give it back to us, we will plant your food, we will build your houses, we will live like you. Please let us live. In 1843, Bill Bellary was standing in the face of death in the Garden of Gethsemane, for want of a better term, but here on the banks of the Yarra, begging for the life of his people. They were given some land inland, beautiful river flats at Akron River, and they produced, I think it was about 8,000 acres, some of the best vegetable gardens in the state. The next door neighbour, a squatter. Now, all squatters in this state are illegal. None of them paid for the land. And they became the first government. As this is just a secret, everybody. Bruce Pascoe called the first government a bunch of crooks and drunks. Anyway, they're up on the Akron River, growing the biggest tomatoes and potatoes. We actually have sketches of them. And the squatter next door resented it totally and lobbied the government to get rid of them. So they were sent to a place a little bit further inland called Mahika, which was just gravel. It was an old volcanic area. It was just gravel. They couldn't grow anything. So they walked back to Healesville just at the time when the Victorian government were, one, developing policy to take children away. The whole idea of taking children away was to breed the colour out, because you realise they weren't allowed back onto the reserves, along with developing the first laws in Australia to develop reserves. So they developed the reserve at Healesville, where the Aboriginal people developed the best hops farm in Victoria, didn't they? You know the story of Corranderk? That, of course, was taken away from them, with William Barrick, who was Bill and Bellary's Simon Wonga, then William Barrick, who then walked in the 1870s back into the Victorian government to beg to keep their land, to keep that Corranderk property, even allow the administrators, the chaplain, to stay and administer them. Please let us stay on that land. They didn't, did they? By the 1880s, they'd taken the land off them. But I want you to hear that story, because that's where I'm going to finish. In 1843, Bill and Bellary stood in front of the New South Wales government, the English government, the English military, and I'm going to finish the English aristocracy, apparently my relatives, and said, please give us back a little piece of our land. We will live a life just like yours. We will wear your clothes, we will plant your food, we will build your houses. We will be just like you. I hear the echoes of that every day, that begging for life. This Garden of Eden, for me, is a Garden of Gethsemane. Waminjaka. Thank you, Tim.